Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Productivity and Profitability webinar, brought to you by MLA and hosted by myself, Hilary Beach from Home Sacket. Tonight, we welcome Andrew Whitelaw from Mecardo. He is going to talk about the African Swine Fever and the impacts it's having on the Australian red meat market now and into 2020. So thanks, Andrew, for being here tonight. Great topic, as Matt Dalglish, also from Mecardo, gave us a bit of a taster on it last fortnight, and it's really good to expand on this topic and get an insight into what the fever is going to have impact in the Australian market. So just a bit of housekeeping to begin with. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. The control panel on the right-hand side of your screen right now will have a red or orange button to the left of it. You can tap this button to collapse or reinstate the control panel if you want to have a better look at the slides that Andrew is going to be presenting tonight. Please type your questions in the box provided. We'll get to them at the end of the session and I will be relaying them to Andrew, so please make them as succinct as possible. Type them as the presentation goes on and I will address them at the end of the session. So I'd just like to introduce Andrew Whitelaw from Mecardo. As Mecardo's Business Development Manager, Andrew is responsible for managing both the strategic direction and day-to-day operations of Mecardo. Andrew has a strong agricultural background with extensive understanding of agricultural markets and commodity risk management. Andrew has an undergraduate in IT, a master's degree in agribusiness, and is a PhD candidate in agricultural economics. And in addition to working with Mecardo, Andrew is also an owner of a commercial piggery, so quite a range of expertise there. So welcome, Andrew. I will talk to you and we can get started.
Thank you very much. You made me sound really clever there.
Yeah. Well, you sent it to me. All right, yep, that looks really good. Good to go.
Okay, today we're here to talk about African swine fever and how it will impact upon you. I doubt there's many other pig producers on this webinar listening in, but even though you're not a pig producer, it will impact upon you in a positive and in some cases a negative way. So many of you might be aware of African swine fever, but we're going to go through quite a bit on how it will impact upon different sectors. We are currently really in an apocalypse when it comes to pork. We are seeing events which we have never seen in agricultural markets in anyone's lifetime that's alive. So things are looking very bad when it comes to pork in Southeast Asia, and this is going to provide plenty of opportunities for you as red meat producers. So today we are going to cover off on a number of different topics. Firstly, we're going to cover off on the impact of African swine fever, the opportunity for meat, but also we'll cover off on a section that's not really been discussed that often, but the risk for grain producers. And many of you producers, I'm assuming, will be mixed producers and may well also have grain. So it's also quite important to consider that part of your business. So in the background just now, we've got a map, an animated map, which should be showing on your screen, which shows the spread of African swine fever really since early last year until present. I think it's important to outline and set the scene here with this map because it is, in my view, quite a scary map when we look at it. African swine fever has been around for a long time. It's actually been around since the early part of last century, before the First World War. It was first diagnosed in Kenya, after which it spread throughout the continent. And in the 2007, it actually, the risk elevated when it reached Europe. And from there, it spread around Central and Eastern Europe. And it's been very hard to keep this disease under control because of the fact that in Eastern Europe, they have a lot of household pigs, a lot of wild boars, and it's very hard to keep the biosecurity in control. But really, the importance of African swine fever didn't really become apparent until the middle of last year when the disease swept through China. And just to give you a bit of a background, the disease itself is extremely virulent. It is hard to kill, it doesn't need a living host, and it has a 90% mortality rate for pigs that are infected. When the disease can be spread through things like food, it can be spread through contact to contact, but it can also be spread through things like rodents and dust. And one of the biggest risk factors we have in Australia, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later on, is the fact that the disease can stay alive within frozen pork for more than 3 years and can survive up to 100 degrees Celsius cooking. So the possibility of it spreading throughout the world is extremely high. And that is what we have seen over the past 18 months. So really, the first place in this story to start is in China. And it is a story of Chinese whispers in reality. So I want to start looking at the pig price in China. And on this chart, we can see that at the start of the year, pig prices were actually at the bottom end of the expected range, which doesn't make sense to an extent because last year, we had African swine fever hit China. The reality was that pig farmers knew African swine fever was rampaging through the country, so they saw it as a bit of a slow-moving tidal wave coming through the Chinese mainland. So when they saw it in the next village, they would cull as many of their animals as possible and send them to market and sell them before the government came in and killed them all. Which actually meant at the start of this year, there was an excess supply of pork, which in turn meant that the market actually fell for pork pricing. And right through this period of time, there was a big issue where China were basically saying that they had only killed less than 5 million pigs for most of this year, in fact. But the reality is that the markets always tell the truth. And the data out of China is always very opaque. There's a lack of transparency. And what we found was it came to the middle of the year, and the reality was that the truth of the extent of the cull came out in the pricing signals. So even in June, the Chinese government were saying that, well, there's nothing to see here. We're all okay. There's nothing wrong with our animals. And then all of a sudden, the market started to take off. And we saw pig prices basically spend June all the way through until early November in one direction only, and that was upwards. So we saw a very drastic rise in pricing. And that really tells us that there is far more than 5 million pigs being culled in China. Eventually, in recent months, they have admitted that it is in the hundreds of millions of pigs that have been culled. So now we have the truth, and the pricing signals really tell us what has happened. So to summarize that this is extremely important, pork is the most consumed protein source in China, and pork prices in China have increased by over 165% year on year as we speak. Chinese data is also notoriously opaque. It's very hard to get concrete information out of the Chinese government that can be trusted and relied upon. So how does this make a difference to Australian pork producers? Can we get some value from this as a pork producer by exporting into China? I'll give you a little bit of a background here to let you know about how our industry compares. This chart represents the total days supply that we can provide to China if every single kilogram of pork which Australia produces was sent to China. We would be able to produce or provide China with just over 3 days of their demand from our complete crop. So we would not make much of an impact whatsoever on China's demand. The other thing is that because we've not been an important exporter of pork, we do not have any export protocols in place to actually allow us to send our pork to China. So we have no export protocols, and 100% of our Australian production equals 3 days of supply. So how, even though we can't export to China, how has our local pork managed to benefit? Many of you might be aware, if you look at your Coles or Woolies, and if you look at the small goods section, that a large percentage of the products on the shelves are actually imported products. So over this decade, we've roughly been between 35 and 40% of our overall pork has been imported from overseas. The majority of this, or all of this, really is in small goods and processed goods, salamis, sausages, and bacons. And basically anything that has a bone in it is from Australia. So because we import such a large volume, that means we have a flow-on effect from what happens in the rest of the world. So at the start of this year, when China was saying that nothing was going wrong, that there wasn't an issue with African swine fever, it was all under control, the Chinese government, or people acting on behalf of Chinese interests, went out to all the exporting countries in the world. A good example of that is Denmark. And they bought as much as they could get their hands on. If it oinked and was pink, they were buying it. And this meant the prices around the world went up through the roof. And this meant that places like Denmark, which are a major exporter, they suddenly ran out of exportable surplus because they'd already sold it to Chinese customers. And then that flowed through to Australia. In Australia, we ended up with a lot of our buyers or importers of small goods suddenly found that they couldn't get access to small goods to bring into Australia, which meant that they were having to either pay up or focus on domestic supplies, which has helped push the market through to almost record, or will be record probably by the end of this week, pricing levels. And interestingly enough, if we look at the green line in this chart, we can see that in 2018, our pork prices were extremely low. So most pork producers in Australia were losing money because we had extremely low prices for our end product, but we're also paying extremely high prices for our grains. And many of you farmers may have feedlots, and you will have been aware of the high prices paid for grains during the past 18 months. So to summarize on the pork, before we get into the traditional red meat areas, most small goods of pork are imported. Our traditional suppliers are selling to China. So we are now struggling to fill demand locally, which means our price has increased. One of our biggest risks is biosecurity in the pork industry. And during the past year, during November to August of this year, there was around about 27 tons of pork intercepted at the airport, which was attempted to bring through the border. We are lucky that this was found, because a large percentage of this illegally imported meat has been found to be positive for African swine fever. So I want to put it in perspective, because I think this is important, because in all likelihood, there has been meat which has gone past biosecurity that hasn't been found, which is liable to be infected with African swine fever. And to put some numbers around this, because 27 tons is a big number, it works out to about 6.3 pigs equivalent per week on average are intercepted. Approximately 50% of intercepted pork has been positive for African swine fever. And really, to put it in a good old sausage sanger and to put some equivalency around it, if all of that pork that was intercepted were converted to sausages, we would have over 8,000 sausages per week being intercepted at Australian airports, which may come up in a pub quiz sometime, so just remember that. So now, probably onto the bit that you people will be more interested in, is what this means for sheep and beef. Chinese per capita meat consumption is actually very high, and compared to a lot of the world, and with a growing affluent economy, they are eating more and more meat. But unlike Western diets, they eat a lot more fish and a lot more pork. At the moment, or in 2018, it was around about 109 kilos per capita. But 2019 has seen a significant increase in alternatives to pork. Because we've seen a large percentage of the herd go, we are finding that they're having to replace that protein with something else, which is beneficial to our protein producers. The Asian pig herd is the biggest in the world. China is by far the biggest, at around about 440 million pigs. But the rest of Asia is also a major pig producer. And as we can see in this chart, this green area here is the Chinese pig herd. And there's other smaller countries like Vietnam that make up the rest of about 109 million pigs. So this is a large population of pigs, and the world has around about 800 million pigs. And I wanted to show you with this representation how many of these countries have been impacted by African swine fever. I'll leave that one with you for a second, but it really shows you that if we look at the Southeast Asia and Asia major, that there are not many countries that haven't been impacted by African swine fever. And we believe that a few of these countries are liable to be impacted, especially Thailand, in coming months. So there are 441 million pigs in China and 106 million in the rest of Asia. And African swine fever impacted countries are representing 94% of the Asian herd. And that is also more than 50% of the global herd. So this is going to be a big impact on Chinese ability to feed their populace with protein. At the moment, it is looking liable to be about 120 million pigs dead or culled, a 30% drop in the breeder herd, which makes about a 20 million ton gap in pork production. This chart here currently shows, in this line here, in this bar, sorry, what the actual production is based on initial estimates for this year. And now I've changed it. We can see there is a drop in production to about 32 million tons in 2020. So China is now aggressively buying up protein across the world. Beef from New Zealand, South America, chicken from Brazil, pork from the USA, and anywhere they can get any form of protein, they're buying it, which is fantastic for us. And on this chart, we can see that in 2020, they will increase their pork imports, but they have no ability to increase pork to the level that they had prior to this African swine fever. So this shows you the gap that they have in their protein requirements is extremely large. We're all aware in recent times of the rise of China. It was always going to become an extremely important customer for Australia. And year on year, we've seen large increases in our exports of beef and other commodities. And it was increasing year on year. However, if we look at this chart, we can see that this year, beef exports have just gone to the moon. And this is largely because they are grabbing as much beef as possible. And what that's meant is that beef exports are up 122%. So these are levels that we would be expecting China to get to within the decade, or next decade, sorry. We're nearly at the end of this decade. But what's happened now is African swine fever has actually basically put a turbo on everything and made everything run home a lot quicker than everyone was expecting, which is, effectively a great opportunity for Australia. And for you sheep producers, we're seeing very similar with mutton. We are seeing exports month on month, apart from in July, well above where they have been in previous years and well above the 5-year average. And even in October, we just saw things go extremely through the roof from the previous month of about 80,000 tons to 12,000 tons. And this is a phenomenal increase. And this is one of the reasons why our prices are going so high. And we are going to see this demand stay for some time. One of the reasons why mutton has been extremely popular is because mutton actually fits in well with the culinary tastes of the Chinese population. It is good for being boiled, and it's good for use in a soup. And it's very similar to a lot of the goat meat and sheep meat that they already consume from the likes of Mongolia and in the northern parts of China. Llama exports have been increasing as well, not quite as high as we have seen for this year as beef and mutton, but again, extremely high and taken off really rapidly during September and October. So this is fantastic news for you as producers. I know things have been tough in the last couple of years with drought, but what this has meant is that those who are destocking have been able to achieve a good price compared to all previous droughts that Australia has experienced. And this has been one of the benefits of African swine fever. Many of you may be grain producers as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of losing such a large herd of pigs, which is effectively a very strong demand driver for feed grains around the world. And this may make an impact upon you if you're a feedlotter yourself and you will be buying feed over the next couple of years. So our team at Mecardo, we developed a feed model, and we developed this using Chinese-specific feed conversion ratios by pulling upon science and literature from universities in China. And we used this to develop effectively a a formula and a model for determining how much feed China should be utilizing in any given year. This works by taking effectively the conversion ratios for 1 kilo of meat and how many kilos of feed it takes to produce that 1 kilo of meat. Clearly, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that if you kill a couple of 100 million pigs, feed demand will be down dramatically. And initially, when we were modeling this early on in the year, we were looking at around about a 10% drop in pork demand. However, we also had to factor in some other models, which were a 30% and a 50% drop in feed demand. It has to be mentioned that the feed demand within China isn't just cereals. It is soybean meal, it is corn and barley, and in many cases, especially in backyard operations, is swill. But this is a good representation of the overall feed demand. And because all commodities tend to have a large degree of replaceability, it means that when one form of feed drops in price, other ones will drop in lockstep. So to put some numbers around this, a 10% drop in pork meat in China equates to 31 million tons drop in feed demand. A 30% drop equals 60 million tons, and 50% equals about 89 million tons, rounded up. So this is a big fall. And it's important to remember that feed is one of the biggest costs of a pork farm. And what we will see is that these numbers are more than likely to be close to being correct. Initially, we expected it to be about 10 to 30%. Now, with the data coming out, we expect it's probably closer to the 50% drop in feed demand, or 50% drop in pork production, which equates to that 90 million tons. And again, these are pretty big numbers, so to put it into perspective, a 10% drop in pork meat equates to 3 times the average Australian barley crop. A 30% equals 7 times the Australian barley crop. And the worst case scenario of about 50% drop in pork production equates to about 9 times the overall production or the average production of barley over the last decade in Australia. So that really scares me, to be honest, because it can be China has been a very important customer for Australian barley in recent years, and having this amount of demand come out of the marketplace will impact potentially on grain prices in Australia and globally. So to summarize, we've been talking a lot about pork, and like I said at the start, not many of you listeners are going to be pork producers, but pork is the driver of livestock markets. And this story is going to go on for quite some time. It will take years to get the Chinese pork herd back to where it was. Some estimates, best case scenario is probably 4 years. Worst case scenario, if there are continual reinfections, 10 years. This is a fantastic opportunity. Livestock prices in Australia are well supported, and they will be well supported for quite some time as China looks to replace its missing protein. And I think this is going to be, once we get out of this drought, it will be a positive time. We are going to see some issues around pricing for restocking, because we are going to have, at some point, fingers crossed, we're going to get some rain soon, and the grass will come and we will be looking to restock. And those restocking prices are going to be extremely high because of the fact that we have African swine fever and restocking demand. So prices, are very positive for the upside over the coming year, provided we get the rain, touch wood. It is also potentially negative for global feed demand by virtue of the fact that if we lose 200 million pigs, that feed has to go somewhere. So that really is a bit of a very quick summary of how African swine fever is impacting upon the red meat industry, but also a little bit about how it is impacting upon other industries like pork, which is technically a red meat, and also the impact on global feed demand, which if you are a producer, it could have an impact in the coming years in Australia. So that is my presentation for this evening. If you've got any questions, happy to try and answer them.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really insightful presentation, really succinct and covered all bases there. And you're right, it's quite shocking the impact over all Australian commodities that this reduction in the pork industry is going to have.
I don't think it can be stressed any more than that this is going to be one of the biggest changes in agricultural markets of any of our lifetimes, because we have never seen such a drop in supply in agricultural markets, especially livestock markets, and even things like foot and mouth disease and BSE do not compare to this current outbreak. So this is a fantastic opportunity for Australian producers to literally grab it by the horns and then go with it.
Yeah, and as Matt mentioned last week, it's really a good time for producers, if you have destocked, to really engage with a consultant who's going to help you make those decisions, because it sounds like they're not going to be easy getting back in after the drought breaks, or even now if you're wanting to do that. I'll just give Andrew a bit of a break for a moment. Those who do have to leave, please remember the webinar survey that you will see pop up on your screen when you exit the webinar. Please take 2 minutes to fill out this survey. It's a bit of information that we use and MLA use to make sure that the webinars are being are covering all the bases and what producers are looking for in these webinar series. Also, just to mention, next week we have a double webinar on heterosis. So Tuesday, the 3rd of December, we have Wayne Pitchford talking about heterosis in beef enterprises. And then on Thursday, December the 5th, we have Neil Fogarty talking about heterosis in prime lamb enterprises. So it's Hybrid Vigor Week next week. So make sure you jump on those nights to get through, to have a look into that information on heterosis. I just wanted to start off with a question of my own, if that's right, Andrew. When you showed that graph, I think it was a few slides on the reduction in Chinese pork production and then the increase in imports and how they're not going to be able to meet demand, is that just purely because they cannot just source enough? So they cannot find enough produce to fill that supply?
There's literally not enough pork in the world to meet their demand that they've lost.
Yeah, and so other protein as well.
So that chart just represented pork itself, not other proteins. So they will be able to make up some of the way to fulfill some of their demand. The reality is that they won't be able to meet all of the demand that they've got in China if they buy pretty much all of the export produce from around the world, whether it's sheep, meat, beef, pork, fish.
Yeah.
So a situation where we have a captive market of hungry consumers with relatively deep pockets.
So just on that red meat demand, do you have any insight into Chinese import of goat meat, and will that increase as well?
I don't have it to hand, and I didn't put it onto this PowerPoint. But yes, we are seeing that goat meat exports are also increasing as well, because it's also another attractive meat for Chinese consumers, and it can be cooked in a similar way to mutton. So it really is, if we actually, at Mecardo, we look at every commodity. And when we actually look around the world, we can see basically anywhere where they have the capacity to export any form of protein, we're seeing increases. So we're actually seeing things like eggs increasing in price off the back of this. We're seeing pork and chicken in Brazil increasing. North Atlantic salmon is increasing in price. And we can basically, pretty much say that if it used to have a heartbeat and it tastes good, it'll go to China, which just throws everything up in prices.
Mm. All right. Thanks, Andrew. A question from Fiona. I think you did cover this briefly, but how long will it take for China to rebuild its pork industry, given they will have to change their approach to biosecurity? So I think you did sort of run over this.
I did run over this one briefly, and I think that's like a very good question, and it's one that we've been debating with other analysts within our team and also externally. It really is a hard one to say. I'll answer the first question: how long is it going to be? Well, my view is probably about 7 years for them to get back to the same levels as they had last year, before the pre-outbreak levels. Then the other thing to consider is that over the course of 7 years, their actual natural demand, because of their increasing affluence, will increase during that time, which is also another important factor to take into account. So their actual demand will increase. It'll take some time for their supply to actually meet that existing demand, not to mention another 7 years of demand. It will take some time, though, because of the fact that it will take a number of years just from the breeding process, but there are also issues around ensuring that the biosecurity protocols are in place to ensure that there are no further outbreaks. And we can look at it from the outside. In Australia, in Europe, in the US, we have very strong biosecurity protocols in place on pig farms and on normal meat farms. But in China, a lot of pigs come from small-scale operations, and they don't have the biosecurity protocols in place in many cases. A lot of pig farms are also, or a lot of pigs in China are actually run in the back of people's houses, and they may be fed swill feeding, which is illegal in most westernized countries. And because of the fact that African swine fever can stay in meat for a long period of time after the animal has been killed, all it takes is one pork bun to be fed to a pig in 5 years' time, and the event to start all over again. So I think it will be a number of years, probably around about 5 to 7 years would be my estimate at the moment. And this provides a good opportunity. What we are seeing, though, is big changes in China. There are a number of large-scale farms which are more like European farms or Australian pig farms, and they aren't being infected because they do have the biosecurity protocols in place. And these farms are making money hand over fist. They're literally killing the pig. And what that means is that they are going to consolidate and they're going to become much bigger. And the Chinese government will take this extremely seriously. They cannot afford to have a food security crisis of this scale. And to even put it to another, to show the importance of pork in China, is actually causing an impact to their GDP of between 1 and 3%. That is how much pork prices have gone up and how that has affected their GDP, because of the price of food in China has gone up so dramatically that it has increased their CPI, or Consumer Price Index, by the highest rates since 2012. So China will want to ensure that they don't not get any more disease outbreaks in the future, because this outranks any other real animal disease that we've had in recent years, even things like avian flu, which we had in China until recently.
Wow, it's quite phenomenal. Another question from Alana. Alana says, thanks, Andrew. Do you see a point where beef and sheep prices rise to the point of substantially impacting the Australian domestic consumption?
Yes, I do. And I know it sounds bad, but I don't really care to an extent, as long as somebody's buying it. At some point, I do think that, and it's at the rates that Chinese imports are increasing, we're not far off China becoming a bigger customer than the domestic market. They have the money to pay for it. We should never rely on just one country, of course, but they have the money to pay for it. They have the ability to take it, because they could take it all, and we still wouldn't make a huge dent in their overall demand. But we will see, in all likelihood, we will see substitution in Australia. It tends to be, lamb and beef get substituted by pork. Pork is increasing in price, but it is still a cheap protein. And then we will see substitution again further down into chicken. And even if we look at the cheapest protein sources, which are actually probably our animal protein sources, would be eggs, we are seeing increasing demand in the last 2 years for eggs, because of the fact that they are a cheap protein source. I don't mean to be, I guess I don't want to mean to be glib by saying I don't really care about the domestic market. I just want to make sure that farmers get paid the best that they can get paid. And in the future, that may not be the domestic market.
No worries. Thanks, Andrew. Another question, there's a few here, so it's really got people thinking. Charles has asked, if the fever spreads to the greater Asian area, will it also have a bigger impact on prices, or will it just lead to famine? Also, will it spread to Canada and the Americas? And he just wants you to have a guess, as no one can really know.
I can have a guess. Thanks for that. Okay. Well, look, it is going through Southeast Asia and other Asian countries. And it is actually important to remember that I've been talking largely about the Chinese demand for protein. I didn't touch upon the fact that Vietnam and all these other Asian countries that have had to cull pigs, their demand is going to go up as well. So I hadn't even covered that. So that is another demand factor. But on the other way of looking at it, in a lot of these countries, we eat a lot of pork in Australia, but in a lot of these countries, meat and animal proteins is a luxury. It isn't something they eat on a daily basis. So does it lead to famine? I don't necessarily think it leads to famine. I do think it will potentially lead to lower economic growth for farming communities in parts of Southeast Asia. So people who relied on those pigs are going to be in strife. I'm very doubtful that there'll be very generous compensation schemes that in Australia we would be liable to get compensation if our animals were culled due to disease. But there are other, obviously, food sources which are non-animal protein, rice and veggies, and which a large part of the population in Asia is reliant upon. In terms of will it get into Canada and the US, your guess is as good as mine, but it only takes one piece of salami to get that disease going. And it is, it does concern me that it could get into there. I am a bit more concerned about it getting into Australia, because we have already found a high volume of illegally imported pork coming into the country. But we also, and many of you will be aware, and it'll be a big issue on your farms, that we have a big wild or feral pig population in Australia. And all it really takes is somebody in going camping to drop a sandwich and a feral pig to eat a piece of salami that's infected with African swine fever. And we could have a wild pig population with African swine fever that, you know, many of you will have tried to control wild pigs on your properties. It's very hard, and that is why there are calls for increased funding for a pig cull. So yes, I don't know if that answers your question. I guess the answer is maybe time will tell, and quite probably it is a possibility. Let's hope we don't get it in Australia.
Yeah, wow. Thanks, Andrew. Andrew, who's obviously a savvy beef producer, wants to know, what is China's preferred type of beef to import? Do you know?
I'm going to have to defer on that question. I'm happy to send a response. I'll have to look into it. We do know that they do like, in terms of the sheep, we know that they like the more mutton and goats like sheep. And I'm guessing, and I will be able to confirm this, I'll be able to send an email to Homes and Second, and they'll hopefully be able to pass it on. So I can do some research into that, because it is a good question.
Yeah.
I'm imagining they'll be looking for a meat which goes well with their style of cooking, which to me is, you know, soup, ones that go with soup.
Yeah.
I know this doesn't sound like a good answer, but I can get back to you with some research on that if that's okay.
No worries. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Andrew. And also, if you are wanting to contact Andrew, you had your details up at the beginning of the webinar. So I'm sure an email, if we can't answer a question tonight, we will probably be able to look into it for you.
Definitely. Either me or somebody else on the team will be able to help out.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I think you've really nearly covered this question from Neil, but China, you've just said they can obviously afford to keep paying these elevated prices, as you said, if they wanted to buy all of Australia's export produce, they could.
Yep. They basically, at the moment, the economy in China is probably not rising at the level it has in the past, but they still have a growing affluent population, a population that has a taste for meat. They do eat substantially higher levels of protein than the world average, nowhere near the levels of Australians. We are one of the highest in terms of our per capita meat consumption, but it is a high and well above average per capita consumption of meat. They want it, and yes, I think they have the capacity to pay for it for some time. And we have to remember the sheer scale of the population in China and the sheer scale of the middle class population, which is important, is they don't have to eat meat every day, but if they eat meat once a week, it is a huge volume. So yes, they may cut down the volume, that their per capita use of proteins, but the sheer number of people going into middle class and being capable of purchasing meat is increasing year on year, and even with younger people as well.
This question might be a bit hard to answer, Andrew, seeing as we've never really seen something like this before, but is there a chance of the Chinese per capita consumption of what makes up their protein diet when they substitute the pork with other proteins, is there a possibility of that changing fundamentally and not correcting after the swine fever has gone?
That is an absolutely fantastic question, and this is a task for anyone who's working for Meat and Livestock Australia. If they're listening to this podcast, this webinar, they are going to be eating more alternate proteins, beef, sheep and goats. What we want to do as an industry is we want to make sure that in 7 years, when they get their pork herd up, that they say, oh, but I really loved that steak, or that mutton was fantastic. Get me some more of that. Because we want to change their palate to like Australian meat. And this is where some of our money should be going, is increasing that brand awareness of Australian meat. Yes, it is possible that they can change their taste. There has actually been a bit of research that has shown that in China itself, that they are actually, a number of sectors of society are actually avoiding pork meat. Just to let you know that pork with African swine fever actually has no impact upon human health, but they are shying away from it. And we have to remember that a lot of the population doesn't really trust food in China. We had the melamine scare sort of 10 years ago. And so they don't necessarily trust it when people say that a food product is safe. So they are switching from pork, some people, even if they can get access to it and even if they can afford it. But yes, I think we have the potential to increase the increase the alternate proteins going into China and to keep them at high levels, or at least higher levels than we have just now. We were already seeing that prior to this African swine fever, but we just had a boost in the last 18 months. But yes, it's the job of the industry, whether you're an exporters within the industry or Meat and Livestock Australia as the representative body or marketing body, to hopefully continue that trend and stop them from switching out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just another opportunity there for our industry. So another question which I think is really pertinent right now, Andrew, what listed companies are you aware of, or if you've looked into this, would be or are working on a vaccine for the virus?
I'm not aware of the specific companies which are looking at the vaccine. I know there are some governmental agencies around the world working on one. But if the question is around somebody wanting to invest in something that will go up with African swine fever, obviously a vaccine will, the company behind a vaccine will make a lot of money. There are listed companies in China which are involved in pork production, and their share price has risen dramatically. But going back to the vaccine, at the moment there is no vaccine. There are works to get one. Up until now, there was never really any major impetus to actually develop a vaccine because the problem wasn't big. Now that we've lost 200 million pigs in China, more resources are being thrown at it. But no, I'm not aware of any listed companies which are working on a vaccine. But that would actually be interesting if somebody else knows that. I'd be interested to track their share price.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. And just on that, actually, I think you nearly just answered this next question. Could you just please repeat the number of pigs in the world that have been lost and how many are expected to be lost?
So at the moment, the estimates in terms of numbers, we're probably looking at about 25% of the overall herd, which equates to, well, without having a calculator in front of me, around about 250 million pigs over the last, let's call it 3 years. And that includes Eastern Europe, the rest of Asia, and China. A big percentage of these are also breeding stocks, so the sows, which is one of the big issues because it takes a lot longer to create a sow than it does to grow out a pig for slaughter. But 25% is a good number to go with in terms of the global pig herd for this year.
Thanks, Andrew. I might just roll two questions into one here. If ASF gets into Australia, will it spell the end of free-range pork production in Australia? And can producers sleep at night if you've borrowed money to increase your own pork production within Australia, are we a case of if or when?
Okay, okay, I'll answer the first question. In terms of the free range, yes, I think that is a major risk. I can only talk for my farm and the customers I deal with in the pork industry. Not overly concerned about it, if I'm completely honest. We take very stringent biosecurity measures. Our pigs are never in contact with any other animals other than the ones they should be. However, free-range piggeries, where they're completely, in paddocks, a lot of them, we have seen instances of wild boars or wild pigs, getting into there and interbreeding in commercial free-range piggeries, and that is a risk. Definitely, if I was a free-range piggery owner at the moment, I would be extremely concerned. In terms of the second question, I believe, was around can you sleep at night with investments in pork? I think everyone is probably concerned because you never know what's going to happen. I'm not personally overall that concerned. If there is a cull of animals, I believe there is compensation schemes. I know that there are compensation schemes for cattle and sheep producers if there was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. I assume, you should never assume, but I assume that it's a similar type of compensation scheme for producers in the event of a cull, especially in light of the fact that African swine fever isn't actually deadly to humans. I think as well as that, we don't have many piggeries that are close to other piggeries. There's generally quite a distance between them, which protects that. The third part of that question, I think, was, is it a case of if but when?
Yeah.
I personally believe African swine fever is already in the country. Our biosecurity protocols do the best that they can do with the resources they have. They have found 27 tons of illegally imported meat. 50% of that was positive for African swine fever. We know that things get past biosecurity because we know there's lots of drugs in the country and lots of other things that shouldn't be in the country. So I wouldn't be surprised if some pork meat has slipped past biosecurity, and chances are some of it will have African swine fever. The only good thing we have at the moment is that none of that has got into the pig community. Touch wood, fingers crossed. I think we've got, if we were to call it, in that old nuclear Cold War thing, I would say we should be on DEFCON 3 or 4 in terms of the risk.
Wow. Well, that's all the questions for tonight, Andrew, and it seems like there's a lot of upside, but also a lot of probabilities and unknowns and waiting and seeing at the moment, and it's definitely something to keep your finger on the pulse on. And I look forward to what Mecardo brings out, into 2020 about the forecasts and the impacts of African swine fever and where it's heading. I know you guys do a really fantastic podcast, so I'm sure we'll be hearing about it on there. So just a reminder, everyone, next week, 2 webinars, Tuesday night and Thursday night, 8 p.m. on heterosis in beef enterprises and heterosis in lamb enterprises. Thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us tonight and taking us through that really interesting presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week.